For example, if we want this like weird shade of like, you know, unknown kind of orangey purple, like right here, this weird like browny, salmony shade, whatever that is. So whatever that is, right? This shade is pretty high up in the blue versus yellow space, right? So your cells that prefer like a yellow center and, well, your cells that prefer like a yellow spot and do like blue spots, right? Those would be like moderately active, right? And, you know, and similarly, your cells that like are sensitive to red-green contrast, right? Your cells that prefer redder shades and don't like greener shades, those would also be moderately active, right? And your green preferring cells would be less active, as would your blue preferring cells, right? So by the combination of how that red-green pathway is activating and how much that blue-yellow pathway is activating, you can kind of describe any hue that, that we are capable of perceiving, right? Now that was, I skipped over one important thing, kind of, right, which is that you also have kind of an achromatic pathway. So it's a little bit funky, right, because you get non-color-based or achromatic information from your rod system, right? But it actually turns out that you can also use your cones for achromatic processing. So what basically happens here is that similarly to your kind of yellow sensitive cells, you combine the light information from your red and green cones. Again, for whatever reason, the blue cones just get left out of this. And those are just sort of sensitive to like any light, basically, right? So, I mean, yellower light is the best stimulus for these, but you know, any light will stimulate some. You actually have this third pathway that is only sensitive to the brightness of things, right? So, you do get brightness information from your rods, but even if you had no rods, you would also have this kind of achromatic pathway that would be capable of processing like black and white or grayscale stimuli, you know, just based on the overall amount of light falling on the red and green cones, right? So all these things together essentially give you this LAB color space, right? So like the pure lightness, which is the L in the LAB color space, is done by this achromatic pathway, and then the red versus green contrast and the blue versus yellow contrast are what describe the actual hue of the colors you're seeing, right? So this is essentially neurally how, you know, how it works out, how it's kind of processed in the brain, and that LAB color space that we use to describe colors, like, you know, just in numbers, is based on that system. Okay. Questions so far? I don't know how much, again, like, I don't know how much this makes sense to you guys, how much you even care. But any questions about how this works? Okay. So the key thing to note here, I guess, is, you know, you might have hypothesized, right, that like you have cells in your nervous system that are maybe like orange preferring cells, right, that specifically like the color orange or specifically like the color purple or whatever, right? And that's actually not the case, at least in the early stages of processing, right? So in the early stages of processing, you kind of have these kind of three separate pathways. That one pathway only cares about how bright something is overall, one pathway only cares about how red versus green it is, you know, and one pathway only cares about how blue versus yellow it is. So you don't have a cell that specifically prefers colors like orange or purple or whatever. You have to like infer that by a combination of how much these three different pathways are activated. Now later on in the nervous system, you do get cells that respond to like more nameable colors that kind of like, you know, like orange or purple or pink or whatever, and don't sort of like fall into these three pathways, but that doesn't happen until a much later stage of the visual system. So this is kind of how it happens in the early stages, like retina, LCN, and early visual cortex. Okay, so questions about any of that before we move